Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture we are going to start getting into the nitty-gritty of prefixed verbs of motion. We're going to learn the basic concept behind prefixed verbs of motion and how to form them with the different verbs of motion. So how to form the different verbs of motion when we add the prefixes to them. So without further ado, let's jump in. So, how do we use prefixes with verbs of motion? We can add prefixes to the basic verbs of motion you learned in Chapter 8 to convey more information about the direction of the motion. So, with these basic verbs of motion you learned in Chapter 8, those convey unidirectionality versus multidirectionality. When we add prefixes to these verbs of motion, aside from the prefix på, which we went over in the last lecture, but when we add other prefixes to these verbs of motion, they lose their directionality, so they lose the unidirectional versus multidirectional distinction, but they gain verbal aspect, they become aspectual pairs, and we get some more information about the type of motion like arriving, departing, entering, exiting, and so on and so forth. So, when a prefix is added to a unidirectional verb of motion, the verb becomes perfective. Remember, unidirectional verbs of motion without a prefix are imperfective. If we add a prefix to a unidirectional verb of motion, it becomes perfective. So, iti is imperfective. We add the prefix pri to it, and we get priti, and that's perfective. However, when a prefix is added to a multidirectional verb of motion, the verb remains imperfective. So if we take khadits, for example, and we add pri to it, and we get prikhadits, and that is imperfective. So now we have an aspectual pair. Prikhadits, imperfective, and priti, perfective. On slide 3 of the PowerPoint, I have a chart here of some common prefixes that we will go over in more detail later in the chapter. But here you can just look at this chart and you can see that many of them are paired. So for instance, we'll start with the most common. Pri indicates arrival and u indicates departure. Va indicates entrance and vi indicates exiting. Pod indicates approaching or movement towards a goal. Do indicates movement up to a specific goal. And the opposite of those two is ot, which is movement away from. And then vza is movement upwards, and sa is movement off of or downwards. Pro is movement past, by, or through, and pire is movement over or across. And then the last one isn't really paired with anything, but we have za, which indicates, with a verb of motion, it indicates a side trip or picking up or dropping off someone or dropping by someone's house. So those are the most common prefixes. There are more, but those are the most common prefixes of verbs of motion. And we will go over them in more detail in later lectures. So how do we make these prefixed verbs of motion? With Etihad verbs, we can add the prefix to hadit, just directly add the prefix to hadit, and it will not change. You take pri and you get prihadit, you take u and you get uhadit, and so on and so forth. However, with et, when we add a prefix, the base et, I, de, ta, I, becomes et, but it's spelled ikratkoya ta, I. So, for example, pro plus et becomes preiti, spelled p-r-o ikratkoya te-i. Pire plus et becomes piriti, again, p-ye-r-ye ikratkoya te-i. Or do plus et becomes daiti, de-o ikratkoya te-i. And something to keep in mind is if the prefix ends in a consonant, which many of them do, you're normally going to have to add o between the prefix and et. So vo plus et becomes vaiti, ve-o ikratkoya ta-i. Pod plus et becomes padaiti, ot plus et becomes ataiti, sa plus et becomes saiti, and vz plus et becomes vzaiti. So notice how we've added an o to each of these prefixes before we attach them to the basic verb. And in the past tense of these ET verbs, you're going to have the same past tense as the unprefixed form, so shol, shla, shlo, shli, and you just add the prefix. So vaiti becomes vashol, vashla, padaiti becomes padashol, padashla. And note the stress on viti, it is on the v, so we have viti, vishol, vishla, vishla, vishli. What about yechet yezdit verbs? With these vehicular verbs of motion, yezdit becomes yujats when a prefix is added, and it is first conjugation like chitat, so yujayu, yujayish, but yujats on its own does not exist as a verb. It only exists with prefixes. So for example, we have priyujat, to arrive by vehicle, uyujat, to depart by vehicle, vyujat, to exit by vehicle, and they conjugate priyajayu, uyajayu, vyujayu. Yechet conjugates the same with and without a prefix, so priyechet becomes priyedu, priyedish, priyedut. In both cases, because yechet yejat begin with a vowel, prefixes that end in consonants add hard sign between the prefix and the verb. So you're going to have v hard sign yejats or yechets, as in vyejats, vyechets. The same with pod, ot, s, and vz are all going to add a hard sign after the prefix and before the beginning of the verbal root. And then we have the other verbs of motion. So litat, litiat conjugate the same with prefixes as without prefixes. Nothing changes. Bijat retains its conjugation, and remember, it's one of the few truly irregular verbs in Russian, and it maintains its irregularity when you add prefixes. Bieget, the multidirectional version, shifts stress to the second syllable if you add a prefix, any prefix other than po. So pribiegat, ubiegat, or podbiegats, for instance. Pleat is the same with and without prefixes, but plavat becomes plivats when we add a prefix. So we have priplivats, uplivats, or podplivats. Finally, let's go over a couple of quick tips for using prefixed verbs of motion. And the main thing to remember at this point is that in the past tense, an imperfective prefixed verb of motion indicates that the action is no longer in force, that the person is no longer there. So, for instance, if we say родители приезжали к нам в гости, my parents came to visit, it's imperfective, and so they have already left. They came to visit and then they left. Versus a perfective prefixed verb of motion, which means that the action is still in force, that the subject is still there. They haven't left wherever they went to. So if we say родители приехали к нам в гости, it means my parents have come to visit and they are still here. And this kind of seems like directionality maybe, and it may be a little hangover from directionality, but it's also this concept of aspect where imperfective means something where the action is no longer in force, and perfective means that the action is still in force, that the action still has an effect. So you can look at it either way. So that is something to remember with prefixed verbs of motion. I hope you found that quick introduction to the basic concept of prefixed verbs of motion helpful. In the next lectures, we will go over the different prefixes in more detail.